So today we have two exciting guests. Before I introduce our guests for today, let me briefly advertise the SwissNLP Days. So I'm sharing my slides right now in the meeting. The SwissNLP Days, it's a 3-day event taking place from the 13th to the 15th of May in Winterthur. And it consists of an expo that's directed at companies and academic institutions. It also comprises the Swiss Text Scientific Conference. And the crash course session that we have today is one of several crash course sessions that lead up to the SwissNLP Days. So if you find the session of today relevant for your business or your research, then you will also find very likely the SwissNLP Days interesting. So please check the SwissNLP Days out. So with that, let me introduce our two speakers of today. So we have Alla Stöckli. She's a language solutions architect at SwissGlobal, one of the leading language service providers in Switzerland. And we have Claudio Paonessa. He's a co-founder of Noxenum GmbH, a startup in the area of NLP. And they will tell us about the future of machine translation. So how can you use LLMs and other state-of-the-art NLP technology to improve machine translation? So without further ado, Alla, would you like to start?
Let me just share my screen. Let me know if you see it. I think it should be all right.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Yanis. Yeah, thank you also to SwissNLP for the invitation. So as Yanis already said, my name is Alla Stöckli. I am a language solutions architect here at SwissGlobal. And today, Claudio and I are going to talk about the future of machine translation, specifically with the focus on large language models. So I will tell you about the specificities of implementing LLMs in the localization industry, and Claudio will then go into more technical details. So to start off, a few words about SwissGlobal. We are a language service provider based in Baden. We specialize primarily in translation in the fields of banking and finance, legal documentation, commodity and energy. And we are a member of SwissNLP. And as a member of SwissNLP, we are actively evaluating and implementing AI solutions in our workflows to help us enhance our translations. So first, a little bit of background information about the localization processes in general. Here I have a little bit of an overview about translation workflows. And in a traditional translation workflow, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, the process starts with human translation. And then it is followed by a revision step and then a quality assurance step in the end. Nowadays, of course, the machine translation workflow has become very popular. And in this case, the content is first pre-translated using machine translation. And then it goes through post-editing by a human linguist. And then, of course, again, a quality assurance step that is always part of this process. The benefits of this workflow compared to human translation are, of course, faster turnaround times, because, of course, the human translation takes much longer than machine translation, and, of course, lower cost. And both of these workflows result in something we call translation memory, which is a database where previously approved translations are stored and then can be used for future projects as well. There are also a few important considerations that I should mention before we go into the topic of LLMs. One specific point that relates directly to localization workflows and generally the work of translators and project managers, localization project managers, is the fact that we work with computer assistant translation tools, or CAT tools for short. Here on this slide, I added just a few of those. So, for example, Trados, Across, MemoQ, those are very well-known tools that translators work with. And so it is a program which translators use in their work. And then when thinking about LLMs, it's important to consider whether a specific CAT tool supports the integration of a specific LLM. So it's to a certain extent, it's a question of compatibility. Another point that I wanted to mention here is data security. So of course, some companies have very specific data security concerns. Another very important point is the quality of the output for a particular language or a language combination. So if the quality is lacking, human translation may be a better option because, of course, correcting a faulty machine output may take longer than translation from scratch would take. And then also not all post editors would agree to work with such output. So basically, it comes down to two options: commercial LLMs versus smaller LLMs that can be hosted on premise. Here I have an overview of each option and what they entail and how they compare. We, of course, don't have that much time today, so I will not go into a lot of detail here. Let me just highlight a few of those points. The more important ones. And the first one is, of course, as I already mentioned, the data security. So some organizations have strict confidentiality requirements, and they prefer on-premise models because they offer full control over sensitive data. With no or minimal exposure to external sources. And in contrast, of course, commercial LLMs normally involve sending data to third-party servers, which then may raise concerns around data privacy and compliance. Then the other point that follows us from the previous slides, the integration with CAT tools. So integration with CAT tools is more straightforward with commercial LLMs because many of them already support localization tools out of the box. And on-premise models usually would require custom integration efforts. So either through a custom plugin that maybe you would have to write yourself, or through APIs. And that's, of course, additional effort. And then customization is another factor that I wanted to mention. On-premise models can be trained and fine-tuned on domain and client-specific data and terminology, if that's what you want to do. But that then also means, of course, that the effort of updating the model lies on you. And if the data becomes outdated, the models require retraining. And that is, of course, going to be resource and time consuming. And by comparison, while commercial LLMs offer limited fine-tuning, a lot can be done through prompting. And then, of course, they get regular updates that get implemented without any additional effort. Maybe we can, I will leave it at that. Maybe we can come back to this slide later if people have questions or comments. But I would move on here to the specific challenges where LLMs can be of help in the area of localization. And let me start with a challenge that is very important for us to solve: style guide integration. So if we are talking about terminology and previous translations. This is the data that is usually stored in a more structured way. So for example, in terms of tables or Excel sheets or XMLs, and style guides tend to be less structured, which means that they are actually a perfect candidate for where LLMs can come in handy. And here on that slide, I have an example of such a prompt specifically for Canadian French. I color-coded the categories. The categories are just examples. There's a lot more you can do. It's basically just a question of imagination, what you can put in your prompt. But the color coding, if you want, if you're interested, you can play around with it while we speak, while I tell you a little bit about each of the category that I included here. And then check whether you were right. A lot of them also overlap, or some of them also overlap. So the first one covers such specific requirements like data number formatting, punctuation handling. So of course, depending on the language, punctuation can also be very specific. Then style and tone is, I think, one of those examples that by now many people already know when it comes to LLM prompting. So this is, for example, where you can ask your LLM to generate a text that is more or less formal. Then if the text you're trying to translate contains very locale specific wording, for example, a cultural reference, that may be subject to cultural adaptation. So this is the third point I have here. So for example, if you have a cultural reference in your source language, you may want to localize this reference in your target language because the target audience may not understand the original reference. Then also inclusive language adaptation, that refers to the question, for example, of gendering or adaptation for a specific target audience. So for example, plain language for impaired people or non-native speakers. And then there is the language variant customization, which could be wording or spelling, grammar of a particular language variant. Think, for example, of Brazilian Portuguese versus European Portuguese, or even the example that we all know very well here, the German variant of German and the Swiss or Austrian variants. So when it comes to that, we of course know that even the punctuation, or maybe not so much punctuation, but the spelling would differ between the German variant and the Swiss variant. So moving on, here is my version of that color coding exercise. As I said, some of these overlap. I would say that cultural adaptation and regional customization may overlap a little bit. Yeah, so that's how we solved this issue here with this prompt. Let me move on to the next point. Terminology is another big topic where LLMs can be very helpful. First of all, terminology can be integrated into the localization process in form of a glossary. In that case, the LLM can refer to it when creating a translation. Here on the screenshot, I hope you can see it. It's an example of a ChatGPT plugin where there's an option to enable terminology-aware translation suggestions. So in that case, the plugin will use the glossary that is already implemented in the project and will create translations based on that. I also must add here that, of course, glossaries have to be compatible in format or have a compatible format and structure. And have to be generally well maintained, because badly maintained glossaries, for example, if they contain synonyms or duplicates or terms that are too broad, that will only lead to generation of misleading translations or imprecise translations. And moving on to the second one, the correct terminology can be injected in the post-processing step. So in that case, we are speaking of a workflow where a translation has been done by a human or a machine. And then LLM is used in a post-processing step of post-processing the output. And then another important aspect where LLMs can be helpful is terminology extraction. So this is done not within a translation workflow per se, but it can be done in addition to it. If you have a textual document or even two documents in the source and target languages, let's say, an LLM can be able to align the terminology from these two documents and create a bilingual glossary for you. In that case, you can create a glossary from an unstructured text. And then also more importantly, it can then output the generated glossary in an appropriate format. So for example, if you wanted in an Excel format, it can do that for you, or it can even export an XML format for you, and that way you can then work on that file within a specialized terminology management tool. Moving on to another point here I wanted to mention is quality estimation. First of all, LLMs can detect and classify errors that might appear in the text. Here, this is just an example. I took the MQM, which is a multi-dimensional quality metric, as an example. It covers such things like terminology issues, fluency and style, what we already also discussed before, locale conventions and audience appropriateness. This can be used as a reference. So this is the kind of errors that an LLM will be able to detect. And then where they can also help is confidence scoring and translation quality. So here we are talking about the post-processing of the output or of the translation. And LLM can generate probability scores for translation accuracy. They can output quality scores or flags for a translation. So for example, needs review or acceptable, or even a kind of a color, again, a color coding system where green would mean that the output is good enough and maybe doesn't need to be given a second look. And maybe then red ones would require more human attention. So that can help you prioritize segments that are kind of have lower confidence. Then another point here that we already kind of mentioned is pre-editing suggestions and post-editing. So pre-editing refers to kind of the suggestions that an LLM can give to a post-editor. And post-editing, the third point I mentioned here, is more of a machine step. So if a translation has been done by a human and then we use an LLM to make a post-editing suggestion of this output. And the last point I have here is, of course, the adherence to client-specific prompting. And that refers to the client-specific guidelines that you might have had in your prompt for your LLM when it got translated. And here you can kind of check whether that was adhered to. Okay, I saved the best for last. As you may know, context awareness and document level understanding is something that makes LLMs stand out in comparison to neural machine translation. LLMs understand more of a global meaning of the text, and that makes it possible for them to maintain consistency, so be it in terminology or maybe reference resolution. general nuances in the text. And that, of course, leads to better quality translation. But why do I mention it last is exactly what I've been talking for probably 50% of this presentation, is that we get back to the topic of CAT tools. The thing is that if we look at CAT tools, many of them limit this potential by sending text to translation segment by segment. So segments it can be an individual sentence or it can be a phrase. Sometimes it's a bigger chunk of text, but it never is a full document. And this, of course, restricts the context and can cause custom prompting to malfunction or misfire. In that case, the prompts get applied to a very short text, and then it can lead to hallucinations, for example, or the context of the prompt does not apply to the small context that is given in the segment, and then that just creates some issues. Once again, to reiterate the same point, it is highly dependent on the CAT tool, and the combination of the CAT tool and LLM is definitely something to be considered. So to wrap things up, LLMs offer real value to the localization industry. That is not a question. They help improve quality, consistency, and efficiency, especially when it comes to terminology, tone, and style. You can include very guideline-specific details into your prompts that will then get translated or will get considered when translating or when generating a translation. But to really make that all work, we need to understand the specifics of how localization processes work, like the limitations of CAT tools, like data sensitivity, and also the need for human post-editing. So LLMs can be seen as a complement to these established processes and not necessarily a replacement, or at least not yet. And when properly integrated, they can become very helpful in localization. That's all from my side. Claudio can now take over.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Okay, did this work?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, just quickly about me. So during my master, I focused on a lot of data science topics. Altogether, I have 5 years of experience in applied research. I worked at the Institute for Data Science of the FHNW, and there I focused on document processing, automation of document processing, and also speech recognition and speech translation, with also focus on Swiss German dialects. Since more than 2 years, I am a co-founder and managing partner of the Noxenum GmbH, where we also focus on automation of processes, AI, agentic workflows, also machine translation, image recognition, and structured data capturing. We founded Noxenum in 2022. We are seated in Aarau, and we are also a member of SwissNLP. So I will talk about also the change in the machine translation world through large language models. So we basically, just as a short overview, we started with rule-based systems for automated machine translation, and then went over to more classical statistical approaches, then went into the deep learning era with neural machine translation, and now we are kind of transferring into large language models for that. So what do large language models introduce, which is new? Alla talked about that. It's about contextual awareness, or more the potential to have contextual awareness, of course, because not all tools which use large language models to fully use this potential to add a lot of context. And some would argue that these large language models produce better translations, more fluent. The key questions I will talk about is how these large language models are reshaping current workflows, and practically how are these style guides and references effectively incorporated into the instructions of the large language models. And also I raised the question if the traditional way of fine-tuning neural machine translation models is still relevant in the era of large language models, or if we can forget about that. So we all know that currently the large language models are kind of transforming the world of language services, and also because traditional machine translation models, which were mainly phrase-based, are now kind of replaced with large language models, which are more contextually aware. And we have a very high flexibility of adapting to different domains, to new customers with different tones, all through prompting without having a lot of fine-tuning time. And also, of course, large language models go way beyond only the translation. And here I found from Localize, I found a quick summary of some experiments from them where they checked different language pairs and compared different large language model-based translation systems. For example, OpenAI's GPT, Anthropic Claude, and Gemini from Google, and compared them to Google Translate and DeepL or Microsoft Translator. And then they came to the conclusion that Claude produced better translations based on pairwise comparisons where professionals kind of rated them blindly. So how can we incorporate style guides? We saw an example of a style guide before from Alla, and how we can also incorporate reference translations. So the easiest way, we can just use a prompt. So for example, translate in formal tone, and then we kind of instruct the large language model to use a formal tone in this case. And also we can use something which is called few-shot learning, where we provide some reference translations and then hope that the translation quality is better. But the most interesting part about that is we can do that dynamically, so which means we can kind of decide for each translation task which references we want to include, or which part of the glossary is relevant, and so on. So we can feed the LLM with glossary and only the relevant part of glossaries, brand guidelines, for example, and as I already said, translations, example translation from the past, from something like a translation memory. But what is really powerful here is the combination with retrieval augmented generation, where we not only use a fixed set of, let's say, 10 or 100 reference translations, but we dynamically fetch them, which kind of choose only the references which are in this context relevant and useful for the translation task. in case of using large language models, a lot of the challenges become prompt engineering challenges. So we end up having to tune, instead of tuning a machine translation model and preparing high quality of data, we have to iterate through prompt engineering and try to adapt to our needs and test that. And the difficult part here is that we want that our rules are consistently applied to the translation, and that is the challenge here we have to overcome when it comes to large language models. So here just a practical example of instruction of a system instruction for a large language model, where we want to have them translate texts from German to English or English to German. Just very quick example here. Of course, that can be include more details than this. But the important part here is the end of the role description, where we instruct the large language model to also use the given style guide, the given glossary, and the given references, and then we define them below in the prompt. What I did here, I used markdown syntax. So usually I prefer the markdown syntax when you want to be kind of agnostic to the large language model. Some large language models, for example, Claude from Anthropic, prefers kind of this XML structure. ChatGPT is very good in handling JSON structures and so on, and Markdown is something like in between, where both of these commercial models understand this structure. So I'm a big fan of using Markdown to structure your prompt. And we already saw a very detailed style guide before. This is just another example here. This could be a style guide from Apple, where we want sophistication, simplicity, and all these buzzwords for a very technical language, but also easily digestible and so on. For the references, so there are different structures. We can inject different references into this prompt. What I did here is I used the structure, which is called TMX. This is an XML definition for translation memory. So this is kind of an industry standard. And here we define so-called translation units, TUs, and with the two segments, one in English and one in German. And we directly include this XML structure into the prompt without any other processing. And we kind of hope that the large language model understands this structure easily, because it's quite clear. Also, we can include, of course, much shorter examples, which could be more like a glossary terms. But for this example, I only show some translation references and not the glossary. So when we want to try this out, so here I also thought about another method where we also instruct the large language model to not only give us the translation, but also kind of tries to reason on the decision on how and why some specific parts were translated this way, and instructed that it should also reference the style guide or the given glossary or the given references in this case. So just a quick experiment that which could be quite powerful if we not only get the translation, but also some information on why some stuff got translated that way. So here, this example is a text from the Apple website about the new MacBook Air, for example, here. And I used the prompt I showed before, the prompt structure, and instructed GPT-4o with the translation task to translate this text here. And it gave this translation on top and also tried to reason on some things. So here are 3 points where the model answered with that it maintained structure. And the second part is quite interesting, that it used the reference translation to ensure consistency. And then we could go back and see what references were used. And also here the reference for Zentrierung des Kameraausschnittes, the camera frame centering, was translated based on our reference given. When we wouldn't do this specialized prompting and just instruct the large language model to translate it to German, in this case, we would get quite a different translation. And the red parts I marked here are things that wouldn't be quite Apple-like, or the reader wouldn't be happy with them. Some things are literally translated word by word. For example, the Kamerarahmenzentrierung, it's a really bad translation and wouldn't be, Apple wouldn't want that to be on their homepage. And I did the same with the Claude 3.7 Sonnet, the biggest and newest model from Anthropic. And we have a very similar translation here, and a little bit more details in the reasoning here. But of course, the reasoning instruction is very short and not a lot of specifics. So we have to tune that that it gets really consistent and instructed what we really want to know about why and why something is translated that way. Very similar references. Something like directly aligned with reference translation provided. Also here used exact terminology from reference translation and so on. So we also can kind of use this reasons to then further improve it in a post-editing step. So now I showed an example where I just used 3 references. Usually the context you can give to such a large language model is limited. And so you want to wisely choose the references you want to include in your prompt. And traditionally, you would do that by just a basic search algorithm, usually exact or fuzzy string matching, where you search through your translation memory. But that is very limited. And you really need kind of on a string level matches to find these references. And also it could be that your translation memory contains a lot more references which could be relevant for this specific translation, which wouldn't be found by traditional methods. So I suggest that you could use something semantic based. So in this case, based on embeddings, where you try to incorporate all these references into embedding space, a numeric space, where also the meaning and the semantic of the texts matter. And you then try to find contextually similar text, which do not really need to have exact string matching or fuzzy matching. So then you could kind of use more of a very large corpora, of a very large translation memory, and find more relevant references. So all these tools I talked about, they raise the question if the traditional neural machine translation fine-tuning is kind of dead and not needed anymore. So what speaks for that argument is that we can just use prompt engineering, which means we can really fast adapt translations without the need of costly fine-tuning procedures. But also there are probably domain-specific translations where still specialized neural machine translation models are needed. for example, in the field of legal, medical stuff, or very, very technical things. So it could be that there are domains where the large language model would not adapt well to these things, or there are also languages or language pairs where the large language models does not really cover these very well. It also happen. So now we are in a phase where we usually use this kind of tools in a hybrid approach. For example, we use the large language model only for a post-editing step after a neural machine translation model was already applied. Or we use the large language model for quality estimation, which Alla already talked about. So one thing is that we all know that currently large language models are reshaping translation and all of the language services. We can easily integrate style guides and references into a translation system without any fine-tuning needed. And now the CAT tools need to be adapted. This is the important thing Alla already talked about, where we really want to use the full potential now. So a lot of tools have yet to be built for which really leverage the potential of these large language models for machine translation. Yeah, so I think now we are ready to answer some questions or maybe some discussion about some stuff. I'm really happy to answer.
Okay, so maybe I can offer a first question. So thank you very much for your 2 talks. Very interesting, and you covered a lot from general intuition all the way to technical details. So really informative, I think, for everyone. So my question is, so this new trend that LLMs can be used as an aid in machine translation, is this only relevant for companies like SwissGlobal or Noxenum that are providing machine translation as a service, or is it also relevant for people at any company that uses machine translation as a product?
I think at this point, machine translation and translation in general is probably relevant for everybody, because living in the world that we live in, even if you don't need to translate, let's say, your website or your content into a different language because you work locally, and but then again, working locally, it being Switzerland, you still may want to translate your content into at least 2 languages. I would say that even if it just comes to understanding of something, just content on the internet, if you don't necessarily need human translation for something, you may still want to familiarize yourself with some text or content of an article, anything that can be related to your field. That may be a solution for you as well. And I'm sure many people use machine translation for that purpose as well.
So Serena is asking in the chat, I'm going to read the question. Do you know of any CAT tool provider which puts effort into further development regarding text segmentation?
I would say that probably the browser-based CAT tools, so SmartCat, Localize, Phrase, they are a little more advanced when it comes to segmentation of text, or maybe not so much segmentation, but rather how much text they send per request to a machine translation tool or an LLM that is integrated. I don't know about Trados, I think they also have some limitations when it comes to that. Another tool that is a browser-based tool is Translate 5, that is sending a little more text per request. It's not necessarily a full document, but it's a little more than a segment or a few segments at a time. And then, of course, Across, I think, is just generally a little more limited when it comes to machine translation in general, because they focus more on the security aspect. And so I think their machine translation in general is a little more limited. And when it comes to LLM integration, it's even less possibilities there. So yeah, I think that's all I can speak to as far as my knowledge extends. Maybe just another point, a little less about LLMs and a little more about NMT in general, is MemoQ. They recently bought a company that offers custom machine translation. So you can train your own models and then you can integrate them. And the plugin itself allows both. So it allows both segment-based translation and document-based translation. As far as the integration within MemoQ goes, I can't really say whether it's strictly document-based or strictly segment-based, but the program or the plugin that they just recently bought allows for both. So I hope they are at least trying to work in the direction of document-based translation.
Hello, I have also a very small question. Thank you a lot for presentation. And my question is regarding, maybe it's not the topic, I'm sorry in advance. What about translation or like speech translation, oral translation that goes is it, I think it's used, but do you, if you have some insights about this translation, like translation that can be done in real time or provided from the speech translation, not based on the document, and what are your insights on this subject?
Yeah, so maybe I can talk about that. So now we kind of move towards multimodal large language models, which can not only handle textual input, but also process acoustic signals and also visual signals, so images and audio, and kind of have then a very powerful thing in between, which can handle all three modalities. And some of them even can output all three of these modalities. So generate images, generate audio, and generate text, which means that we would be able, in theory, to have also kind of speech-to-speech simultaneous translation, for example. And I think it's a matter of time where we will have these tools in our hand, where we can then start building products on top of that. Currently, they are kind of limited when it comes to different languages. They have a main focus on English, for example, but this will change very soon, I think.
Serena is asking a follow-up question in the chat. Do you think we'll generally move away from working within CAT tools in the near future, as we may be able to fully integrate translation memories? So what does fully integrate here mean? Does this mean just going directly from a translation memory to the prompt, or?
I guess, yeah, that we can include a full translation memory into a prompt or into a GPT model that we're using. I mean, I don't know. To be honest, it's very, I think translators really appreciate the interface of a CAT tool, and it gives you a lot of possibilities. And I mean, of course, if you only consider the formatting possibilities and the tag, the markup in general that CAT tools allow you to work with, which of course an interface of an LLM does not, which it's also not its goal, so that's understandable too. For me, it's hard to imagine that we will start moving in this direction, especially if we consider that the whole workflow of a translation, kind of the whole translation workflow, then it's hard to say, because then it involves more steps and it involves more specialists working with the output. But yeah, I mean, you can try to use your imagination, I guess. I for now cannot really imagine that, but maybe we will start to get in that direction at some point.
All right, so let's give Alla and Claudio another big round of applause. Thank you very much for taking the time today. So before we leave, I would like to share another one of my slides. It's a slide about the next NLP crash course. It's happening in 2 weeks on the 8th of April. Same time, same place. If you are interested in how to leverage AI for automated document processing from an industry perspective by 2 speakers from Karakun AG, use this QR code right now to sign up, and we'll send you the Zoom link after that.